We met at a rodeo. I found out that we both liked them, but for different reasons. Her because she just loved the rodeo and me because I liked watching the clowns. I never envisioned that I could be a part of a rodeo, but for some reason, even as a kid, I always thought I could be a clown. For those who don't know, rodeo clowns serve to distract bulls from fallen riders. They wear ill-fitting and ridiculous clothing and use the same makeup as circus clowns. Some of their antics serve as comedic relief in very serious and dangerous situations. I have never had the courage to try to ride an angry Brahma bull, nor have I ever entered the arena as a clown, but for some illogical, ill-conceived, and completely insane reason I decided I could be a clown. Anyway, Joanna and I met at a rodeo in Colorado. I was there on vacation and she was there with her family. It was too hot in South Texas in the summer and too cold in Colorado in the winter, so they had homes in both places and split their time between the two. A year after we met, we got married and moved to Louisiana, my home state. 3 years later, she died of cancer. So why bring her up? Because in the 4 years we'd been together, I'd learned more about myself than I ever had before, both good and bad. Besides, the investment portfolio her father had created for her when she was a child had left me with a small security blanket. It wasn't enough to be part of the jet set, but it gave me a break. After she died, I took a couple months off and went back to the same refinery I had worked at since I was 18. I even worked there full-time while I was in college. I was almost 29, had a few bucks, a good job, a good car that I drove every day, and an even better car that I drove on special occasions. That special occasion car was a red 1958 Chevrolet Impala convertible. It was and still is my pride and joy. This led us to the night I was sitting with a woman I had recently started dating. I've never been a fan of romantic comedies, but here I was sitting on my couch, having not had sex since Joanna died, trying to remedy the situation. Unfortunately, my attempts to even get to first base were thwarted by the romantic comedy characters on the screen and the intense scrutiny of my female companions. Realizing that I wouldn't get anywhere, I leaned back in my chair and sipped my beer. After some thought, my attention turned to the screen. I discovered that the main character had just met her pen pal of many years, and they had instantly fallen in love with each other. It reminded me of one of my pen pals. When I was 15 years old, I took my mom's car without her permission and went for a drive. I ended up crashing into another car and wrecked them both. The other driver wasn't hurt, but I broke my left leg. After it was set and put in a cast, I was placed in a juvenile detention center. News about juvenile offenders doesn't usually make the local, much less national news, but my case was an exception. It turned out that the car I hit was a very expensive sports car driven by a nationally known soccer player who grew up and lived in my town, but went to college in another state on a soccer scholarship and then played professionally. He was a very big deal in town, almost everyone knew him and his car, and he was pretty much at the mercy of the town, especially since he was involved in several local charities and gave a lot to the community. He tried to keep a low profile and never spoke about himself in low voices, but everyone seemed to know him and his work. The local TV stations covered the accident, and 2 days later, because he was so famous, the story, with pictures of his expensive car and my mother's old car, was all over the national news programs. What he did afterward has not been reported. When he found out that my mom was divorced, working 2 jobs and a car was her only means of transportation, he took pity on her and bought her a new car. As was his custom, he didn't pay much attention to it. He picked out a car at the dealership, had it shipped to his house, and did not deliver it personally. He dealt directly with the owner of the dealership, and as far as we know, the press didn't find out about it. My mom sent him a thank you note and said she wanted to thank him personally. He and his wife stopped by and treated her to cake and coffee. After that, my mom made an effort to watch every televised game he was in. As a result of this story, I received a letter through a national news station and one of our local channels from a girl in Montana. Her father was a soccer fan and she often watched the games with him. When they saw a story about me crashing into a star's car, she got the idea to write me a letter. Because I was underage, no article or broadcast mentioned my name or showed my picture, so she addressed the letter to the boy who hit George Thompson's car. She sent it to a national station that saw a story on it, which forwarded it to my local station, which called my mom and told her about it. She picked it up at the station, and they of course wanted her to open it up and read it there, but she didn't. I was still in juvie and she brought it to me. I had nothing better to do, so I answered the letter. Her name was Madison, but I preferred Maddie. We corresponded until I married Joanna. They knew of each other, and Joanna thought it was cute that we were still corresponding after all these years. We even invited her to our wedding, but she couldn't make it. Maddie and I had no secrets. We discussed everything about our lives and talked about getting together several times, but we never met. We had exchanged pictures, of course, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that she was an attractive girl. Besides, like any teenager, I had imagined meeting her, sweeping her off her feet, and fucking her. Those feelings went away as I got older and our friendship developed. I told her all about me and my life, and she did the same. After Joanna and I got married, Maddie and I started living apart. Then I found myself sitting on my couch, sipping a beer and next to a woman who was almost in tears watching two actors from TV who were pen pals and had vowed to love each other forever. When the movie was over, my companion decided that the evening was also over and it was time for her to go home, so I walked her out. The next day, I started thinking about Maddie. At one point I deleted her phone number and threw away the letters and pictures, but I went through old boxes to see if I had missed anything. Apparently I had done a great job because I couldn't find anything with her address on it. I hadn't thought of her for about 4 years by then, but once it started, it never stopped. The last time I remembered, she was working as a server at the restaurant at the Miles City Casino. I googled her name and a short article about her wedding came to mind. It turned out that she had married a blackjack dealer at the same casino where she worked. Married or not, I figured it couldn't hurt to say hello to an old friend, so I called the casino to see if she still worked there. She must have been watching the same movie as my friend and I, because when I explained to her why I was calling, she thought it was a great idea, but she couldn't legally confirm or deny that Maddie or her husband were employed, but agreed to give my name and phone number to Maddie if she ever ran into her. Less than 3 hours later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, it wasn't in my contacts, so I ignored it. However, the caller left a message. Oh, my God. Mark? Is that really you? It's Maddie. Madison Steers, but my married name is Newman, not that I was married, but I never changed it back. How you doing? How's your wife? God, it's been years. If you get this, call me back. I'd love to talk to you. Bye. She left her number. Hearing her voice made me feel like an old friend had returned. I called her immediately and we had a long conversation. These calls became a regular occurrence and we both enjoyed them. 2 months after the first call, I was driving to Miles City, Montana. I checked into my room at the casino and called Maddie. She had taken time off work to clean up for me, and not 20 minutes later I called her and she was already knocking on my door. She flew into my arms as soon as I opened the door, and I didn't get a chance to really get a good look at her until I hugged her and held her at arm's length. She was an attractive, slender, and tan blonde with green eyes. I had seen pictures of her, of course, but the reality was much nicer. We had dinner at a local steakhouse because she didn't want to eat at the same restaurant where she worked. We talked and drank until 2 a.m. We met up again at 10 and started all over again. I was there for 3 days and saw her as much as her job allowed. I even met her family. They had a small cattle ranch. When she reminded her father who I was, he remembered and asked if I was in touch with the soccer player whose car I had hit all those years ago. I said I had never met him except at the time of the accident, but I had occasionally seen his name in connection with some charity project in town. Back home, I remembered that conversation. I had no idea why I had never tried to contact him to thank him for what he had done for my mom and me. I googled his name and hundreds of pages opened up to me. Mostly I read about his success in soccer, his generosity, his social life or lack thereof. He was very secretive about his generosity and personal life. He and his wife never appeared on the society pages and it seemed that the only thing he did publicly was go to car shows. The one thing that was conspicuous was that he had married his high school sweetheart when they were both sophomores in college. They had 3 children and are still married today. He had retired from soccer, but would occasionally appear on some of the shows that aired the games. I decided to look him up. It was pretty simple. I have a friend who is an absolute sports fanatic and knows almost everything there is to know about college and professional sports. If there was a sport called Australian ping pong, he would know everything about it. I, on the other hand, couldn't name 6 professional teams in any sport. I first met him when I was in juvie. He was a new officer in the police department then. He was still serving on the police force. We kept in close touch, and I asked him if he knew where George Thompson lived. I could tell you, but you won't get within a mile of the place. Everyone and anyone his uncle wants something from him, so the neighbors are very protective of him. They've organized a neighborhood watch group, and any unfamiliar car that gets on his street is soon surrounded by other cars and driven out of the neighborhood. Why do you want to know that? Those who knew my story had already forgotten it, so I refreshed his memory. He laughed. I'll see what I can do. 2 days later, he asked to see me. He handed me a piece of paper. This is his address, but you probably won't get there. Why not? Someone from the group will meet you. I'll meet you? Yes. As soon as it looks like you're heading toward his house, someone will stop you and chase you away if you're not welcome. You have to realize that this guy is important to the city and loved by the city. There are a lot of people trying to get something from him, mostly money. So this group basically decides who he can and can't date, and he has no say in it. It's not that bad. That certainly sounds bad. He's not in control of his life. Of course. He prefers to help organize charities and organizations. Sometimes he hears about a specific need he'd like to take care of, as in your mother's case, but there were too many up-and-comers and he can't help everyone. He lives in a gated community? That would stop the drive-ins, as you call them. He's got a big gate around the property, but he likes living where he lives and everything works out for him. Don't try to second-guess his lifestyle. Is this neighborhood watch group legal? Probably not, but George tries to live like a normal person, but because he's so famous and has been taken advantage of, his friends are trying to isolate him so he can live a quiet life. And you and other police officers let them get away with it? Well, when someone complains, we communicate with the head of their neighborhood watch group. Does it do any good? No, and we don't expect it. I laughed. Thanks. I'll think of something. I came home and wrote a note. George Thompson, you don't remember me, but about 15 years ago I wrecked your Lamborghini in a collision with my mother's car. We were poor and it was the only transportation we had. You were kind enough to buy her a new car. I know she thanked you, but I never did and wish I had the opportunity to do so in person. She still has that car, but she doesn't drive it anymore. It sits in her garage, and when someone offers to sell it, she makes it unequivocally clear that she will only sell it over her dead body. Mark Leonard. I added my phone number, sealed the note in an envelope, and drove to his neighborhood. I was about 3 blocks from his house when I noticed a car following me. As I turned onto his street, another car stopped in front of me and I had to stop or I would have hit it. The driver got out of the car and walked back to my car. It looks like you're lost. Maybe I can help you, the driver said in a non-threatening, friendly and helpful tone. There are a lot of people in our neighborhood, and we want to make sure they find their way out. I smiled. I had expected about this kind of reception. To be honest, I was hoping to get some help. I have a note for George Thompson, and a friend of mine told me someone could deliver it for me. Who's your friend? Mickey Erickson. Mickey Erickson? Police Lieutenant Mickey Erickson? One and the same. What's your name? Mark Leonard. He said you could come in. Pass me your note and I'll make sure George gets it. I gave him the envelope and went home. Less than an hour after I left the note, my phone rang. The number was blocked, so I had no idea who was calling. Hi. I replied. Is that Mark Leonard? It is. Mark, this is George Thompson. How do you do? Thank you, it's great. Look, I remember that accident and your mom. How is she? She's great, thanks for asking. I'd like to meet you. Why don't you come by tomorrow around 1 o'clock and we'll have a chat? That would be great. I'll see you then. I realized I'd used the word great in all my responses to him, and I felt like an idiot. I'm looking forward to it. The next day I went to his house and had no trouble getting there. His neighbors never bothered me. The gate was open and he greeted me as I pulled into his driveway. "Mark, it's nice to finally meet you." "I have to thank you." "For what?" I asked as we shook hands. "Thanks to you, I've become a better driver. I've become much more careful." We both laughed. "Actually, I'm better, too. Like you, I've gotten a lot more careful." We went over to his house and spent 3 hours just talking about what we both did in life. I had read that he liked old cars, so I told him about my 58. He had a 57 car, so we talked about cars. We talked about the car he bought my mom, and he asked if she would consider selling it to him for his collection and future museum. I told him she wasn't going to charge him for it, but if he really wanted it, it was probably his. At that moment his wife and daughter entered, and he introduced us. "George told us you'd stop by and see us." "Nice to meet you," said his wife, Grace. "I can't believe Daddy didn't kill you," his daughter Melissa added. "I was just a little girl and my brothers and I heard some really bad words come out of his mouth after that accident. He called them his soccer words, and only very angry soccer players were allowed to say them. For a few years she listened to me," George says, "but when she got mad at her first boyfriend, she started using them herself. We haven't been able to stop her since." We all laughed. I felt it was time for me to leave, although they didn't let me know they were ready for me to go. I started to say goodbye and let George know that I was grateful for what he had done for us, and apologized for taking so long to thank him. We were at his front door. "Hey, Mark. We're having some friends over for burgers and beer this Saturday. Why don't you stop by?" "I'd love to." "What time?" "At 2. Bring your mom. I'd like to see her again." She was excited and decided to give him a gift. We put air in the tires of her old car, loaded it into the truck, and drove it to George's house. He, Grace, and Melissa had been alerted to the arrival by neighbors, so they and the other guests were standing outside when we pulled up. There were cheers and laughter as we unloaded. Mom and I had a great time that day, and it was the first of many good days there for me. Not because George and I became friends right away, but because Melissa and I became friends. She was 3 years younger than me and had never been married. She believed, rightly or wrongly, that the men she had serious relationships with only wanted her for access to her father or his money, and it was disgusting. She and I started slowly. After that day with burgers and beer at her house, we had dinner. Then dinner again. Shortly after Melissa and I started dating, Maddie had a long weekend off and I went to Miles City. There isn't much to see in Miles City, but it was Montana and there was a rodeo in town, so we went to it. As always, I enjoyed the clowns and still thought I could do the job and would be good at it. Maddie laughed when I told her. "I don't know about clowning with bulls, but you're pretty good at shooting a bull." We had sex that night. It was the first sex we'd had since Joanna died, and I tried to make up for lost time. We were both completely exhausted by the time it was over, and poor Maddie was so tired by the end that she just laid there and let me beat myself off. We spent 3 very enjoyable days and nights together before I had to leave. I was having dinner with Melissa one night when Maddie called. I saw who it was, but since I was with Melissa, I didn't answer. Melissa told me that if it was important, I should answer it. I told her who it was, explained Maddie and my history, and that we only knew each other because of the incident where I crashed into her father's car. My dates with Melissa continued, as did the phone calls and visits to Maddie, until she started dating another casino employee who took a liking to her and they fell in love. I remembered the movie rom-com and how 2 old pen pals vowed to love each other forever, and chuckled. So much for the movie versus real life. Not that I'm falling in love with Maddie, because I'm not, but I'll see if it's possible to keep in touch with her, but only time will tell. At the same time, I found out that Melissa was also seeing someone else. I was fine with that, because although she and I enjoyed each other's company, nothing romantic was going on, not even kissing. She was fun to be with and I spent a lot of time with her and the rest of her family. Life goes on, and over the next few months communication between Maddie and I ceased, and Melissa and I saw each other less and less often. However, her father and I started spending time together.
He and Grace had 3 children, Melissa and 2 sons.
One son was in the army and the other son, like George, played soccer.
Both were away from home, so I guess I was filling in for them. George and I would go to car shows and partake. I paid and compared different cars.
He drove my 58 and I drove his 57, as well as some other cars.
He wanted my car and made a very good offer for it.
When I declined, he sweetened the offer by adding one of his cars. I would have loved to have it, but didn't want to lose the 58. My mother's car had been cleaned and polished and was in a large garage. He wanted it, like all his cars, to be as original as the day it came off the assembly line. One night we were in his room and he wanted to watch a soccer game. He knew how I felt about sports, so he wasn't surprised when I left. We joked with each other about our extremes, his love of sports and my complete indifference to them. I was just getting into the car when Melissa Speed pulled into the driveway, braked, and screeched to a halt. She got out of the car and sped past me, almost running into the house.
"Good evening, Melissa," I said.
She stopped and turned to me.
"Don't talk to me," she hissed.
"Wait a minute.
I just said good evening. You don't have to tear my head off."
"I'm so sick of all of you," she muttered. I'd heard her use what her father called soccer words a lot, but I'd never heard her speak that way. "I'm done with everyone," she added, turned and headed toward the house. She stopped when I called out to her. "Hey. I don't know who or what upset you, but don't put me on the same level as everyone else you've interacted with.
Maybe you should look in the mirror and think that the problem might be closer to home. As for your opinion of me, well, I don't agree with it." I concluded by saying, "Good night." She ran into the house and I drove down the driveway for what I thought would be the last time. I was sure that after her conversation with my father, I would be unwelcome. I had no idea what had happened on her date, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I didn't deserve such a verbal assault, but I also regretted the words that came out of my own mouth. I decided to try to apologize the next day and limit the damage. I liked George, Grace, and Melissa, and I would hate to lose their friendship. Before I could call, I got a call from Grace. "Good morning, Mark.
We're having a birthday party for George in a couple weeks and we'd like you to come. If you'd like, you can bring a +1 with you."
"Thank you, Grace, and I'd love to come, but I'll be alone." "That's good, because Melissa will be there too, so it can work out."
Apparently Melissa hadn't talked to her mother about our altercation the night before, and since she hadn't, I wouldn't either. I knew I couldn't go to a party without a gift, but what to get the person who has literally everything they need or could possibly need? It's a mystery. However, my invitation could be revoked at any time if Melissa told her parents about our exchange of words. I'd just find something I could return if I needed to, or keep if I liked it. He and I spent a lot of time talking about cars. He had a pretty good Chevrolet collection, but one car he didn't have and wanted, besides my 58, was a fancy Corvair 95 Ramside, which was a cargo version of Chevrolet's Corvair Coupe. His dad had a car like that, and George remembered having fun with him in it. Those memories were strong and meaningful to him, and he wanted one. He hadn't found the 58 he wanted, and he didn't want to buy it and then pay to restore it. He wanted a completed car if he could find one. He liked mine, but I wasn't going to sell it. There were plenty of 58s for sale, and it was only a matter of time before he found the one he wanted. The Corvair 95 Ramside, however, was a rare bird. He'd been looking for a car like this for a long time. I got on the internet and spent every spare minute for a week looking for such a car for him. I knew he wasn't interested in restoring a regular car, but he would like a Ramside if he could find one. I finally came across one in Omaha. It was a little rusty, but completely complete and original, and originality was important to George. Plus it was rideable. I still hadn't gotten my invitation rescinded, so I called Grace and told her about Ramside. She almost freaked out.
"Oh my God, he'll love you forever." "Can we buy him?" she exclaimed.
"It's available, but I don't know if the price is reasonable. And if the owner finds out who wants it, the price will probably go up. Besides, it would probably take a lot of time and money to restore it." I told her that the owner recognized that it had some rust, which probably means it was a rust bucket.
I don't care. He's been looking for it for years. Will we be able to get him here in time for the holiday?
I'll try, but the owner needs either cash or a cashier's check. Tell him you'll pay his price.
I'll take the cashier's check. We just need to get him here.
Okay.
I'll see what I can do.
I contacted the owner and made a deal before anyone else did, assuming there would be someone else willing to buy it. He assured me that the car was drivable, but I wasn't going to risk driving it home. I went to George's neighborhood watch group and told them about the situation. My cousin has a restoration business, and he's got a couple kickbacks, said one of the group. He likes George, so maybe I can talk him into going after him.
That sounds great. Call him.
Within 24 hours I closed the deal and found transportation. The next day I met Grace at the bank and she gave me a cashier's check. I then met with the owner of the rollback and we drove to Omaha. We took turns driving, drove to Omaha, handed over the check and transferred ownership. When I told the clerk whose name was on the title as the new owner, the old owner asked if it was the soccer player. I replied that it was, and he laughed.
I'm glad I didn't know that.
I'm not sure if I would have charged him less because of who he is or more because of who he is. We got home and the party was still 2 days away, so we spent some time inspecting and cleaning Rampside. The owner of the rollback had 2 mechanics make sure it was rideable. Come the birthday party, Rampside was parked at the gate. I was there for about an hour and mingled with the other guests. Several were George's former teammates and seemed disappointed that I wasn't impressed when we were introduced to each other. George's explanation was that I was an idiot and should be forgiven. 2 of his sons were there, and I got to know them and their wives.
Melissa made no attempt to speak to me, and vice versa.
The party was in the backyard, and the plan was for me to drive the Rampside into the yard while everyone was singing birthday greetings. Then Grace was to turn it around and everything would be in place. The plan worked perfectly, and George was stunned. "Oh my God, it's even the same color as Dad's," he exclaimed, running his hands over it. I handed him the keys and he hugged me.
If you've never been hugged by a professional soccer player, it's an unforgettable sight.
It's like being squeezed in an embrace, and you feel like your lungs have collapsed from the pressure. He and Grace went for a ride on it and they were gone for a long time.
Most of the guests, including me, left before they returned.
I felt proud of myself. A week passed.
George was enjoying his new toy and was ready for its complete restoration. He wanted to be able to ride it every day. He called and asked me to come over.
There are tons of places that restore cars, and they are located all over the country.
Are there any good ones nearby that you know of? He asked. I couldn't have imagined it.
I could never afford a full restoration, even with the money Joanna had left me.
I'm sure we can find a car like that. I assume you don't want it to be just a show car?
Hell no, I want to drive it. We spent the better part of a week trying to find the place. When we found one, it turned out to be not that far away and the photos of some of their work were amazing. The question of his identity came up for us again.
Should we tell the store who the owner was, or should I pretend it was mine?
We decided not to tell them who owned the car and assumed it was mine. We agreed that the car would be taken to the store we had chosen.
I went with him and discussed everything George wanted done.
The shop gave us a price. I called George and he approved it. He transferred the down payment needed to start the work. All of this was done in the days I took as vacation. I had 2 more weeks of vacation left, but I didn't plan to take them. When George's car was safely delivered to the shop, I went back to work. The first night, when I had nothing to do at home, the phone rang.
It was Melissa.
"Hi, Mark," she said when I answered. "I want to thank you for helping Mom with Dad's new truck car.
He really likes it. I enjoyed doing it."
"Well, I guess that's it," she said after a long silence.
"Okay. Goodbye." I hung up.
I had a few dates with my mother's friend's daughter.
She was nice, friendly and funny, but there was no connection between them. Communication. I missed Joanna. Again. Still. Aside from the emotional connection, I really wanted to be with someone before I started to feel completely alone.
Joanna and I had a few friends, but they were mostly married, and I always felt out of place when I was with them.
No matter how hard I tried, being alone was never as much fun as it was with Joanna.
I hated to think that my whole life would be the same. I started going to one of our casinos on Friday nights.
Then Friday and Saturday nights too.
I tried the slot machines, but they were more boring than my life outside the casino.
Then I tried dice. That didn't last long because I never fully understood it.
Then I sat down at a Texas Hold'em table.
That got my attention and kept it.
I realized very early on that it was better to be lucky than good, and I was very lucky. However, I also learned that luck is a good start, but there comes a point where skill true. MPS luck, so even if you are dealt good cards, a more skillful player can still win the hand.
I've always known that billion-dollar casinos aren't built if every player wins.
They manage to be built because most players lose. The house doesn't mind paying out big winnings from time to time because there are so few of them. The sheer number of small losers more than compensates for the few big winners. I've been playing cards for a few months now and have been learning to lose less with each session. I know that no one becomes a good player in just a couple months, but with observation and experience you can improve somewhat in a short time. In all my time at the table I have had 3 really good nights. On those 3 nights I walked away with much bigger winnings than when I started. I was still losing overall, but those 3 nights made the other nights acceptable.
It was a Saturday night and there was no way I could win.
I drew some good cards, but another player drew better cards and played them well. I took what was left of my stack and went to one of the bars for a drink.
Halfway through my second drink, I looked over and saw Melissa at a table with some guy.
I couldn't hear what they were talking about, but she didn't look happy. It was none of my business, so I ignored them.
I finished my drink and started to leave.
As I walked past their table, Melissa stopped me.
"Mark, will you drive me home? If you don't, I'm going to lose my temper with this guy."
I almost felt sorry for the guy, but she didn't elicit much sympathy from me.
Still, I couldn't leave her. I was just leaving. "Grab your stuff, and let's go."
"She came with me and will leave with me," said her attendant, rising to face me.
I laughed. "And what exactly are you going to do to stop her?" "Kicking your ass next week, that's what." "Excuse me. Is everything okay in here?"
A security guard appeared out of nowhere and asked. "It's all right, as far as I'm concerned," I replied.
"Hell no," Melissa's attendant said. "This lady came with me and will leave with me." "Is that so, ma'am?"
the guard asked. "I came with him, but I'm leaving with this man," she said, pointing at me. "Have a nice evening then," he told her. "Looks like you're going home alone," he said to the other guy.
"Hell no."
He headed toward Melissa, but the guard stepped toward him. "I suggest you get over your losses, sir, and either go to your room, if you have one here, or go home. Either way, you'll do it without the lady."
He looked at me.
"And I suggest you take her and go." "Come on, Mark," Melissa said, picking up her purse and walking out. We sat in silence all the way to her house.
She pulled a remote control out of her purse, pressed a button, and the gate opened. I pulled up in front of the house.
She opened the car door and was halfway out of the car when she turned and said,
"Thank you, Mark. I owe you 2 things. First, for talking to you the way I did. You're not like the others because you don't need anything from my father or me. The second thing is my salvation today. I picked another loser, and you're right. The blame may well be mine as well." She walked out, but didn't close the door.
After standing for a few seconds, she leaned over, peered inside, and spoke again.
"It would be nice if you actually wanted something from me. Good night." Oh shit. Later that evening, I sat at home and thought about her last comment.
I thought about all the fun we had had, as well as her behavior, and I was plagued with doubts. In the end, I decided to live my life without the complications that a relationship with her would likely entail. In making this decision, I hoped that her father and I could preserve our relationship. From a purely selfish standpoint, I learned a lot from him, from his knowledge of cars and ways of making money to observing how he interacted with people. He had a knack for recognizing personality types and communicating with them on a level that was perfect for each person. With his own daughter, however, the case was a little different. He wanted to simultaneously support, teach, challenge, love, and punish her. I spent more and more time with George, helping him with his cars. He had plenty of people willing to help him, but for some reason he preferred me, and I enjoyed the time I spent with a man old enough to be my father and the knowledge I gained from talking to him. But for the first couple of weeks after I took Melissa home that evening, I was a little uncomfortable having her around. One day he and I were getting one of his cars ready to load it on a trailer and take it to a show. He really wanted to take the ramp side, but it was far from ready. I checked on him periodically and gave him an update. The store still thought I owned the car. Melissa brought my dad and I glasses of the South's favorite drink, sweet iced tea. We took a break, sipping and chatting, and she kept reminiscing about the party she'd been invited to, but she didn't have a +1. George laughed. What did you expect? You've scattered half the men in town with your "you only like me because of my money" attitude, and the other half have heard of you and want nothing to do with you. You can't find a date to the White House dinner. It's gotten to the point where you have to live with Tommy, where no one knows you and you can start fresh. Tommy was her soccer-playing brother. He lived on the West Coast. Gee, thanks, Dad. You make me look like a bitch from hell. If the shoe fits, honey, wear it. It doesn't fit. So, I've made some mistakes, as you've both so freely pointed out. But that doesn't mean I couldn't find a mate if I really wanted to. George's eyebrows flew up and he looked at me. You told her she was a bitch? Not so verbose. I just told her she might be part of the problem. He laughed. I wouldn't drink that tea again if I were you. You might find yourself drinking arsenic. Even she laughed. I'm not that bad. Really? He ignored her question and asked it of me. When did you tell her that? She doesn't forgive easily. She's still sticking pins in the voodoo doll of the last guy who told her that. Come on, Dad. It was a few weeks ago. I said some terrible things to him and he said the same back to me. It's over and forgotten. Did you have a date? He asked. We both said oh, no, at the same time. She then added. We spent some time together, but I wouldn't consider it a date. Me too, I whispered. Well, maybe you should try going to one of them. It might be interesting. She and I spoke at the same time. I said it was probably a bad idea, and she asked if he was making himself her pimp. When she said that, everyone fell silent and looked at each other. I didn't mean pimp in the sense of finding clients. I meant pimp in the sense of finding dates. George and I started to smile. Our smiles turned into big, toothy grins, and those turned into animal laughter as her discomfort grew. It took another 3 seconds before she said, "Fuck both of you, asses," and walked away. Does she always talk to you like that? I asked him. Not more than a dozen times a week, he grinned, finishing the last of his tea. The car was loaded and ready to go. George looked at me. Why aren't you two dating? She's obviously interested in you. Interested? Or curious? In some circumstances they could be considered one and the same? I don't think so. Interested means you might like someone. Curious means you're curious about how it will be. Not necessarily that you'll like it. There doesn't seem to be much difference between them, Mark. Aren't you curious? I looked at him and smiled. Maybe you are her pimp. He smiled back. Maybe I see something in you too that you don't see, yet. He paused, then uttered. I'm leaving for a show in the morning. Are you sure you can't come with me? I need someone to look after the car while I grab and grin at. He signed autographs, shook hands and kissed children. Most of the shows he traveled to were on weekends. I'd gone to other shows with him and enjoyed myself, but this show was 400 miles away, and I'd promised Mom I'd spend time with her. I'd love to, but I can't. Sorry. Okay, I'll see you when I get back, unless you want to stay for dinner. I think I'll pass up dinner. I have something to do at home.
Have fun at the show. I always do.
My last thought before I went to sleep that night were his words, maybe I see something in you too that you don't see
yet.
Shit.
I didn't have much time to think about Melissa that weekend.
In fact, I didn't think about her until the following Wednesday, when I called her.
Hey, Mark.
Hi.
I was wondering if you needed a date for that party you mentioned. Why do you want to know?
Forget about it.
I knew it was a mistake. I ended the conversation, but almost immediately my phone rang.
I ignored it, but listened to the voicemail she'd left.
Mark, it's me.
I seem to apologize to you all the time because my heart thinks one thing and my head another, but my mouth has a mind of its own and blurts out the most horrible things at the most inopportune times. The thing is, I don't need a date, but I'd like to have one, and as unlikely as it seems, I'd like it to be you. I hope that's what you meant when you called, and my mouth did what it tends to do with alarming frequency.
If not, I'll be happy to ask, will you come to the party with me?
I'll be waiting for your answer. I listened to the voicemail a few times before calling her back.
Hey, Mark. Did you get my message?
Yes.
We used to have fun together.
I don't know why we stopped seeing each other, but I miss the fun. Let's go to a party and see what happens. By the way, where is she?
It's at Jody and Lamar Franklin's house.
You've met them.
It's a mortgage burning party. They've never worn anything formal and they think it's an appropriate occasion to start. It's formal but informal.
They want to celebrate paying off their house debt, but at the same time playfully mock the formalities.
Even their wedding was informal.
She wore a short skirt and blouse and he wore slacks and a shirt. He hates ties and jackets, and she hates everything but jeans and t-shirts.
I laughed. I remember them.
We used to go to their house for crawfish boils.
Crawfish boils are an important social event in Louisiana and on the South Coast. They involve crawfish, corn on the cob, and whole potatoes.
It's all boiled together in spiced water, then piled in a big pile, and everyone gathers around, eating, drinking, and chatting.
Everybody has a good time.
That's for sure.
It was a great party. We talked and laughed for a long time. I enjoyed doing both with her. We both dressed partially formal for the party.
I wore a rented tuxedo, since I didn't have one myself. George offered to lend me one of his, but he weighed 70 or 80 pounds more than I did, so I decided not to wear it.
The rented tuxedo fit me well and went well with my baseball cap and tennis shoes.
Melissa wore a nice dress, but she covered it up with some ugly old scarf to match the party atmosphere. All the guests were dressed alike, and like the last party we attended at their house, it was a real blast. The evening ended with me driving her home at 2 a.m.
I got a kiss on the cheek.
It wasn't long before the kiss turned into a full-blown kiss, and 6 weeks later, sex at my house.
We weren't going to do it at her house.
George and Grace like me, but neither Melissa nor I wanted to test that friendship.
Less than a year after the mortgage burning party, we had our own party, only we had an engagement party. 3 months after that, we signed a prenup and got married.
I was still working at my job, but spending a lot of time with George and his cars. The car he bought for my mom was finished and sitting in his big garage, as was the fully restored Ramside and his other cars. For my mom's birthday, George, Melissa, Grace, and I took her out to dinner. George and Grace picked her up at her house in their car, drove her to the restaurant, and then drove her home afterward.
That made us all smile. Our problems began after George and I took 3 of his cars to a car show.
He was approached there by a man who was a nationally known and respected car restorer. He had a car that had been brought to him for a complete restoration. It wasn't finished and the owner decided to give it up, so the car was put up for sale. It was a 1958 Chevrolet Bel Air convertible, just like the one I had. George had always wanted one, but he didn't want to pay the huge money to buy one and then restore it, and he could never find a restored car to his liking for sale, and he never got mine, although he tried several times to buy it. The restorer showed George and I pictures and videos of the car before the restoration and up to and including its current condition. George liked the car, liked its current condition, and liked the fact that the restorer wanted to finish it like a car straight off the assembly line. No super powerful turbocharged engines, air suspension, or incredible paint job, just a good original car.
Just the kind George likes.
George was going to fly out next week and confirm everything the restorer had said about the car.
He was also going to meet with the current owner and see if they could agree on a price. Only George didn't fly out there. I did.
George, who was very rarely sick, came down with the flu and had knocked out the big, professional soccer player, so he asked me to represent him.
I took 3 vacation days at work and flew to California.
I saw and inspected the car. It was exactly as described in every sense of the word.
I also met the owner at the restoration center.
She hadn't seen the car in months.
It belonged to her ex.
He was the one who wanted it restored.
3 months after the restoration began, they decided to divorce.
It was a bitter divorce, and she only wanted the car because she knew how much he loved her. She also knew she had no intention of completing the restoration and would sell it to someone who wouldn't sell it back to her ex later. He really wanted it and offered to buy it or buy her any new car she wanted, but out of spite she didn't want to sell it to him or anyone who might know him for fear that he would sell it back to her. She had done her research and knew roughly how much the car would be worth when the work was completed. She also knew how much had been paid for the restoration and how much was left to complete.
She was pretty savvy.
But so did George. He gave me parameters in which I could work. She and I sat in the restorer's office to negotiate a price. The 3 of us discussed the value of the car, the approximate restoration costs, and the estimated value after restoration.
Eventually we came to an agreement. George transferred the money and I received the title.
When it was finished and George owned the car, she excused herself and went out for a minute. When she returned a few minutes later, she was laughing hysterically.
"What's so funny?"
I asked, thinking she was going to break the bad news about the car, but she surprised me.
"The funny thing is, my ex hates George Thompson.
When he was still playing, he played for my ex's favorite team, my main rival. My ex cursed and yelled at him every time they played against each other. I just called him to tell him who I sold his favorite car to, and he is furious, and I mean really furious. Tell George he just made my day." All 3 of us laughed, then she picked up her purse, shook our hands, and left.
Not a month later, George called and wanted to see me. When I arrived, he was visibly upset.
"I think you offered me a good deal on the 58, but did you really have to do what you did to get it?"
"What are you talking about?"
"You know what I'm talking about."
"No, I don't."
"Get carried away with the lady."
"What lady?"
"Come on, Mark, the woman I bought the car from. Grace is at your house right now with Melissa, and you're going to be in big trouble when you get home. My daughter, your wife, is going to be furious, and I can't say I blame her."
"I'm not thrilled about it either."
"What are you talking about?" I asked, completely confused.
"I never touched her."
"I swear." "I only spent 3 hours with her, besides, she's older than you."
"Then why did her ex-husband say you did it?"
"Her ex-husband?" "Yes, her ex-husband."
"Why did he say you contacted her?"
"Actually, he didn't say you did, he said I did."
"What?"
"He handed me an envelope addressed to Grace. Inside was a short handwritten note. Mrs. Thompson, your husband was not only a terrible soccer player, but a pathetic, untrustworthy man. My ex-wife told me that when he was here recently buying a car from her, he insisted that she get close to him as part of the deal. She wanted to upset me so badly, because she knows how much I dislike him, that she agreed. And then she started bragging to me about it. If you don't approve of this behavior, I hope you divorce him and make him pay, like my ex did to me. And if you can, get the car as compensation and I will buy it from you."
The letter was signed by Anthony Beglis and contained his phone number.
"George, I swear she's lying."
"I never touched her."
"You're going to have to convince Melissa of that."
"All I know is that I've seen her angry, and I wouldn't want to be in your shoes."
"George, I swear."
He didn't let me finish. "I heard you the first time. Now go convince Melissa, and what do you mean by saying she's older than me? Are you implying that anyone my age is too old for a relationship? Come on, George.
Just trust me."
I don't. Go home, Mark. When I got there, everything went wrong.
Grace had already left, and Melissa was packing her bags.
Packing wasn't the right word, clapping would be more accurate. I tried to convince her that I hadn't done anything wrong.
I detailed virtually every minute I spent with the former Mrs. Beglis, and all the while she kept throwing clothes into the suitcases, without saying anything.
Okay. Stop. Stop and listen to me. That letter was wrong.
She just told him that to upset him.
Nothing happened.
I was never alone with her, ever.
She looked at me with utter disgust. Why? Why did he need to write the letter if he didn't believe in it?
He believes it, but she lied, and he hates your father and wants to get even with him, so he ratted him out to your mother. Besides, he wants his car back.
It's not his car. It's my dad's car.
I don't care who it belongs to.
She lied.
She knew I wasn't your father, but she told him I was.
So you had sex with her? No. That's not what I said.
She lied to piss him off.
What part of that don't you understand?
The part where a complete stranger who needs nothing accuses my husband of adultery. He has a lot of things he wants to accomplish. To get back at your father for all those years of obviously beating his favorite team, and by sending the letter to your mother, he knew your father would be in big trouble. Besides, if he got your mother on his side, he could get his car back.
I already told you. It's not his car.
It belongs to my father, as you must know, since you screwed his wife for it.
I've never fucked her. What do I have to do to convince you? You can't. All you've done is reinforce my opinion of men. She grabbed 2 suitcases and headed for the door. Melissa, you can't be serious. I didn't. And she disappeared.
I tried to talk to her for a week, but she wouldn't return my calls, and when I approached the house, I was stopped by a neighborhood watch. In desperation, I called the guy who was restoring George's 58. I never had Mrs. Beglis's phone number, but I was willing to bet he had it. He gave it to me and I called her.
I didn't tell him why I needed it.
I guess he assumed it was about the car. I explained the situation to her and asked for her help.
Are you serious? That asshole actually sent a letter and said he'd buy the car back? That's not the point. The point is that my wife left me because you lied.
I only did it to piss him off, and apparently it worked, she laughed.
Okay.
Give me your wife's number and I'll call her, and by the way, I apologize if that helps in any way. I never in a million years thought he could do something like this.
How did he know where to send the letter?
He sent it to George's agent, who forwarded it.
Anyway, I'm sorry about that.
Just fix it, please. 2 hours later, Melissa called. I saw her name and breathed a sigh of relief.
I was free. When are you coming home? I asked.
Never, you despicable son of a bitch.
I've heard of low tricks before, but this was the lowest. Asking your whore to call and denying it. Pretty low, Mark.
She told you the truth.
I don't believe it for a minute. Damn it. Why do you believe in lies? Why don't you believe in the truth?
Because the letter was unsolicited, and he had no reason to lie. The phone call was directional, and she had a reason to lie.
Goodbye. He didn't lie, she did. He thought it was true.
He was just repeating what she told him. Her call was an attempt to correct the lie.
Fuck you, Mark. It went on like this for weeks. My calls to Melissa, George, and even Grace went unanswered.
The divorce was big news, and I became persona non grata not only in the Thompson household, but in the whole town, because everyone loved George, and anyone prying into his family was lower than whale shit.
I couldn't catch a break. Even some of the people I worked with stopped talking to me.
It got to the point where I was afraid to eat in restaurants for fear of what they were doing to my food. I tried to defend myself in court during the divorce proceedings and even submitted Mrs. Beglis's affidavit, but no one, including the judge, believed me or her.
I was totally screwed.
After my divorce, I endured exile for about 3 months and decided to take a vacation.
I took a leave of absence from work and left. My mother and I communicated occasionally, and after 2 months of my European vacation, she told me that the furor had died down and things were getting back to normal, and I went home. I found that there was no more work, but that was okay. With what Joanna had left me, I didn't need to work if I was careful. The only member of George's neighborhood council who was still talking to me called one day and said they had just delivered a fully restored 58 and it was gorgeous. The next day I got a call from Melissa. I had no interest in talking to her. None. Zero. None. I didn't answer, but I listened to the voicemail. Mark, call me, please. Fuck her. 3 days later, George called me. I answered. You need to talk to Melissa, he said. I don't think so, George. She has nothing to say that I want to hear. The restorer delivered the 58 to me and we talked about how you went there. He agreed with you and said it couldn't have been because he picked you up at the airport and drove you back. He confirmed that you were never alone with Mrs. Beglise, so you couldn't have had sex with her. Melissa wants to apologize. Tell her thank you, but don't thank her. She had already made up her mind as soon as she heard the lie, so she didn't pay attention to what I said. I know she's your daughter, but really I should thank her because she showed me what I should have expected every time someone else said something about me. My future looks a lot happier with less nonsense in it. Look, I understand your feelings, but you loved her enough to want to spend the rest of your life with her. Don't let one little mistake ruin that. I didn't ruin it. She did, and I don't intend to go back to it. You're serious. You're not going to forgive her. No, I won't. Mark, I understand, and I partly agree with you, but this is my daughter we're talking about. Leave her alone. She's been moping around here since we found out the truth, afraid to call you because she knows you'll say exactly what you said. Grace and I have been trying to convince her otherwise. We told her that you know her well, understand her past and her tendency to distrust men, so you forgive her. She really is sorry. What do you say? I thought for a long time before answering. I'll think about it. That's all I can ask. In the meantime, why don't you come out and look at 58th? Melissa and Grace are having lunch in town tomorrow. Why don't you come by around noon? Okay. I'll see you at noon. This is going to be awkward, I thought. Maybe I should call him back and cancel. Or maybe, deep down, I wanted to go, and secretly hoped Melissa would be there. She would see me and crawl over on her hands and knees begging for forgiveness. I would have laughed at her, turned away, and continued listening to her father rave about his new car. I laughed at myself for even thinking about it. I told him I would go, and I did, but I really didn't want to see her. At noon the next day I was oohing and awing over the 58. They had done a great job and it looked exactly how it should have looked on the showroom floor. I thought my car looked good, but it was second best in comparison. George and I were talking about how he wanted to expand his big barn and add a couple other cars he had his eye on. He was most proud of the Corvair Rampside car because it was related to his father. I was there for a couple of hours and realized I had to leave before Grace and Melissa got back. I was just pulling into the gate when they turned around. Melissa waved. I concentrated on driving. A couple minutes later, my cell phone rang. I ignored it and later deleted the voicemail without listening to it. There's no friendship with George. Not with her life there. When he called me the next day, he basically said the same thing. I really liked him and learned a lot about cars from him. I think at first he thought that exposing me to Melissa's presence would change my mind, but it didn't, and he confirmed it when we talked. We decided that our friendship was something we both enjoyed, but perhaps it should take a back seat, at least for a while. Over the next few weeks, Melissa called 3 times until I blocked her number. After that, I got a call from George's number, and when I answered, it was her. I asked her not to call me again. She didn't. It's been 3 months. I went to the casino occasionally, but the fascination with card games was gone. I wanted to find female company, so I started looking around. I met a couple women on my own, a couple more I was introduced to, and one more I met at a party I attended. The party was actually hosted by Jody and Lamar Franklin, the same couple who organized the mortgage burning party. When Lamar invited me, he assured me that Melissa wouldn't be there. She's going to another party. The party was fun. Lamar introduced me to a girl named Karen and said, "Don't say I didn't give you anything," and winked.
After the party, she invited me over to her place.
I went and got laid.
I realized what Lamar meant.
The next week, I hooked up again. Then again. I liked Karen a lot.
Not necessarily because of her mental acuity or above-average beauty, but because she loved sex and, by her own description, was the closest thing to a nymphomaniac you'll ever know. Karen and I weren't meant to be a couple for long. She was more interested in new guys than in a long-term relationship. We lasted 2 months, but it was a nice 2 months. I took my 58 to a trade show. It wasn't really a show where they judged and gave out awards. It was just a local come and show your car type event where cars were parked in a city park and people would come up and look at them, oohing and awing and asking questions about them. I was talking to a young man and his parents about my car when I heard a familiar voice. I turned around and there was Melissa. It was bound to happen, but it still took me by surprise. "Hey, Mark." "Hey, Melissa. How are you doing?" "Very well, thank you." I decided not to ask how she was doing because, frankly, I didn't care.
"I understand you're dating Karen. Go away, Melissa, and leave me alone." I tried to apologize, "Mark. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I'd like to try to prove it to you. I told you to leave.
I saw your true colors. You heard that I did something wrong, and it was completely in line with your concept of what all men should be like, so you chose to believe it. Unreasonable, untrue, and unsubstantiated, but it fit your concept, so I was automatically wrong.
No judge. No jury. No audience.
Your opinion was formed and you didn't want to be confused by the facts, so you told me to fuck off and walked away.
I told you I was wrong, and I apologize. And I'm supposed to automatically accept your apology?
Well, I don't accept it, so goodbye."
"Mark, listen to me. Goodbye."
There were 5 or 6 people gathered who heard our conversation. When I said goodbye to her for the last time, Melissa and I looked at each other for a long time before she realized we had an audience and left. One of the women who overheard the conversation asked if it was George Thompson's daughter.
Someone else answered in the affirmative.
Another person called me her ex-husband.
That was the end of my car show. I got into my 58 and drove home. The next day there was an article in the local paper about the conversation.
Someone in the audience called the paper and said that George Thompson's daughter apologized to her ex after she realized she was wrong about him having an affair and divorced him. It went on to say that the ex refused to accept her apology and brushed it off.
The story reiterated the details of my Get infidelity and divorce.
The slant of the story should have been that she realized she was wrong and I was right and I should have been exonerated, but no. I was made out to be the bad guy again because poor Melissa, realizing her mistake, saw fit to offer a sincere and heartfelt public apology, but her cruel, insensitive ex-husband ridiculed her in the same public forum and rejected her apology. The story ended with 2 paragraphs of indictment of men in general and me in particular, whose egos prevented them from experiencing the most basic of human feelings, compassion.
Unbelievable.
Once again, the victim was made the villain.
I couldn't grasp the denouement.
I wondered if the author of the story, a woman, had something to do with her proclivity.
Nah. I got a call from Sylvia Wyndham.
What a coincidence, I thought, when she introduced herself. It was the same name as the journalist who had written the article that had denigrated me. My first impulse was to refuse her call, but I decided to find out what she wanted. "I'd like to hear your side of the story, Mr. Leonard.
Let's meet and chat."
"I think you're a little late, Ms. Wyndham. I think a reputable reporter should at least try to get to know both sides before writing a story. That way the readers could decide who was right and who was wrong. Instead, you gave your opinion and left it at that, and in my opinion, that's not reporting the news, but defending your position.
Better late than never, isn't it? I think you deliberately set out to harass an innocent man.
Now you want to hear what he has to say so you can twist his words and finish him off.
No, thank you, Ms. Wyndham. I'm not interested in a conversation as you called it. With that, I ended the conversation. In the evening, both local TV stations showed the same story with the same bias. 2 days later, another story appeared, written by Ms. Wyndham. As it turned out, one Melissa Leonard, née Thompson, met with Ms. Wyndham and explained that she, Ms. Wyndham, had pointed her finger in the wrong direction. Mrs. Leonard allowed that her ex-husband had every right to reject her apology because she had made unfair assumptions. She advised other wives and husbands to look before they leap and give their spouse or lover the benefit of the doubt in general, not just in cases like ours. Otherwise, as in her case, one can ruin a perfectly good marriage or relationship. At the end of the story, she regretted her mistake and wished that others would benefit from her experience and not make the same mistakes. Well, that was great. Both that she corrected the original story and that Ms. Wyndham wrote and published it. I had deleted Melissa's phone number from my contacts, but remembered it and sent her a message. I sent a thank you and immediately deleted her number again. The story was appreciated but didn't change anything. I got tired of being unemployed and started looking for work. The only job I ever had was at an oil refinery. After my divorce, I took a leave of absence, and when I was ready to go back to work, there were no more jobs available. One of the other refineries in town hired me without even knowing who I was because they needed me. Other than car shows, my social life was practically non-existent. Parties every now and then, a drink with one or more of the few friends I had, or maybe even the occasional game, but that was it. One of my friends and I were at a car show in late spring. It was sponsored by one of the local casinos, so there were quite a few cars from other areas. One of them was a 1939 LaSalle Series 39-50 convertible, and it was for sale. There were just over 1,000 of these made, so they were relatively rare. George was a Chevrolet devotee, but always said that if he came across a LaSalle that he liked, he would consider it. I looked it over and called George, not knowing if he would take my call. He didn't answer, but I left a message and he called me back right away. "How much are they asking for it?" he asked. I said, "And you think it's in good condition?" "As far as I can tell, though, I can't get it up on a hoist and look under it. I'm in Boston and won't be home until the day after tomorrow. Even if it's in average condition, it's a fair price, but try to bring it down a bit and don't tell him it's for me or he might go up." An hour of negotiation and a 30-minute test drive, and the car belonged to George. I called him, he called Grace, she wired the money, and we took title. When I gave the clerk the name of the new owner, the old owner had no idea who it was. The clerk knew, but the old owner didn't care. George asked me if I would drive him to the house, and I said I would. My friend followed me as I drove LaSalle. We were already 3 blocks from the house and one of the Sentinel group stopped us. When he saw who it was, he apologized and told me I couldn't go into the house. I grinned and told him what I was doing, but he had his own instructions, so I called George. Shit, I forgot to call them. Let me talk to him. I held the phone so I could hear the conversation. "Hi, George, it's Les." "Les, it's okay. Tell him Mark is on the green list. He just needs to know if Melissa is there so he can avoid her." "Will do." "All right, Mark. You heard the man. Have fun." When Melissa and I got married, I was on the green list too, and I had the remote gate opener, but I returned it. That day when we arrived, the gate was open and Grace was standing at the entrance as we pulled up and waved at me. I got out of the car and she gave me a hug. "It's good to see you, Mark. We miss you." Then she handed me a gate opener. "George asked me to give you this. Now show me this new toy." I spent a few minutes showing her the car before taking her to the large garage. My friend had never been there, so I gave him a tour of the car collection. Melissa was standing in the doorway when we started to leave. She sidestepped so we could pass. Neither of us spoke. In the car, pulling out of the gate, my friend asked, "Was that her?" It was her. "Interesting relationship you have with this family." I don't know if interesting is the right word. What word would you use? Perversion comes to mind,
but not in a sexually perverse way, more of an embarrassment than a perversion, I suppose.
Going back and seeing her doesn't cause you any regrets? Regrets? No, but it makes me wonder. What do you mean?
Sometimes I remember Melissa's paranoia about men just wanting to be around her to gain access to her father or his money.
She was never sure. Then I came along and we decided that paranoia was a thing of the past.
And then Mrs. Beglis tried to piss off her ex.
I chuckled. Did I say tried? She succeeded.
She just didn't know he'd react the way he did. Then Melissa reverted to her old defense mechanism, her paranoia, and I became not just a different man, but worse than all the others. I became the man who convinced her he loved her, only to marry her, to spend time with her father and his cars before cheating on her. She never said that about me spending time with her father, but I think it's a pretty fair assumption. Sometimes deep down I feel sorry for her and want to accept her apology. But sometimes I feel like if I accept them, it'll be like Groundhog Day, and every time someone mentions it, I'll be blamed over and over again.
I don't want to live like that. Do you still love her? It's a complicated question. I'm not sure. Are you going to do anything about it? Another difficult question. I don't know the answer to it either. I like being alone. Sometimes.
When George got home, he and I combed through LaSalle thoroughly and decided that all it needed was to be cleaned, waxed, and put on display. He jokingly said he was going to make me his official car salesman and buyer. The 4th of July was approaching and he invited me to a party they were going to throw.
I hesitated. Damn it, Mark. You've got to do something with her.
She's moping around like she lost her best friend, which she did, and you don't know whether to wipe your watch or get your ass handed to you.
Start living your fucking life and don't let her presence determine your actions. You want to bring a girl? Bring her.
If Melissa doesn't like it, she can go somewhere else or bring her own date.
You're a free man and you're over 21. Start behaving appropriately. For some reason it reminded me of a line from a good movie. Get busy living or get busy dying.
I had no desire to die, so I was going to get busy living.
The party was 2 weeks away. I started looking for a date. I don't know whether I didn't look hard enough or not, but I went to the party alone. George and Grace commented and said that Melissa was alone too.
I was there for about 20 minutes before she found me.
Glad you could make it. There will be fireworks. Now that's what I'm talking about. Big. I've been thinking a lot about our fireworks. About the ones we set off when I thought you'd cheated.
No one said anything, and I was about ready to go do something else, but then she spoke.
I'm really sorry, Mark. I met and fell in love for the first time in my life and then I blew it.
I was so used to dating losers and users that I didn't know what it was like to trust the only person other than my parents that I was supposed to trust.
I can't change that and I can't take it all back. I wish I could. She turned to look at me and touched my arm. Have fun. Mom and Dad are glad you're here. Me too. She patted my hand and walked away. I had a lot of fun.
I chatted with George, Grace, their 2 sons who flew in for the celebration, and members of the community watch.
I stood with the family during the fireworks display and it was quite impressive.
None of them seemed to want to socialize with me, and I felt welcome among them again. Afterward, Tommy, my soccer son, and I were talking when his wife asked to speak to him.
He bowed out and they left.
Soon I was walking beside them and overheard part of their conversation. Tommy's wife, Leslie, was speaking. Then she told him again that she didn't want to leave. She's told him that at least 100 times, but she's still going, Tommy said.
But how can she fix the situation in California? Dad says they can't be fixed. That's why he insists she leave.
Poor girl.
I know, but we can't help her here. She might meet someone out there.
At this point, I was out of earshot. I had another beer, chatted with 2 guys from the next block, said goodbye, and left. It had been nearly 2 weeks. I had no reason to go to George's, and I didn't go, but for the last couple days I've been looking for an excuse and finally found one.
A flimsy one, but I went. When I arrived, George was polishing his ramp side. "What's up, Mark?" "It's not a big deal. I was thinking about that leaky tire on the 55 and decided to check it out." "That's a good idea." I took the tire off, disassembled it, inspected it and replaced it, finding nothing wrong. George was still polishing. He applied some polish and I took the buffer. We worked in silence for another 15 minutes before we stopped. We went to the refrigerator, got a couple of sodas each, sat down and drank. I enjoyed his company, and I almost always learned something new. This time was no exception. "Have you heard anything about Melissa?" he asked. "No." "Should I have?" "Not really. I just thought she might call."
You blocked her number, if I remember correctly.
"Yes, but perhaps enough time has passed." "Maybe so. Why would she call?" He chuckled. "To complain about me, I guess." "Why? What did you do? Or didn't do?" "She wants to come home, and I think it's too soon." "Back home? Where is she?" "California with Tommy and Leslie." "Vacation?"
Sort of. I sent her there to take her mind off you.
"You sent her away?"
My point was that she doesn't do anything she doesn't want to do. She wouldn't normally do that, but I managed to convince her that sticking around here waiting for you was a mistake and she should try her luck there.
You may remember that I told her the same thing before. I remember.
Anyway, she's gone, but she wants to come home. I told her to wait until Christmas.
Why?
No reason, except that I want her to give California a chance.
There are a lot of good men there. There are some good people here, too.
Yeah, but out there, they don't know anything about her and her penchant for letting her mouth write checks her ass can't cash.
Maybe she'll have enough sense to keep her mouth shut. Her mouth isn't so bad once you get used to it.
Ha, he snorted. This coming from the guy who divorced her because of it. She apologized. Yes, and yet she's in California, because you don't agree with that.
I accepted it. But you haven't forgiven her. Maybe it's time for that, too.
We finished our sodas in silence, only occasionally commenting on one of the cars.
That day I sat at home and reflected on my life.
I had done some stupid things and some good things, but overall I had succeeded and was happy.
The happiest was the short time I spent with Joanna.
I tried to find the same happiness and thoughts that I had with Melissa. Honestly, except for those moments when her talkativeness caused problems, our time together was happy, but it ended, obviously, when she accused me of cheating.
How could anyone survive something like that?
And to make matters worse, it was based on a stranger's letter. She took him at his word, not mine.
That must have been almost as painful as the accusation itself.
Then she was convinced of my innocence by the words of another stranger. I think it came down to the fact that she believed what she wanted to believe. She believed the worst, then changed her mind when she got divorced and believed the best.
The problem was, would it always be like this? If we started dating again, could I expect the same thing and was I willing to take the risk? I sat and pondered, boiling it down to the question, was I better off with or without her? Damn it! The answer came to me in the middle of the night. I was absolutely better off without her. That's it. That's it. The decision's made.
I'll tell George and Grace the next day and let them do what they want.
I didn't care anymore. The next day was a work day and I never made it to their house.
In fact, it was almost 2 weeks before I got there. And when I did get there, George wanted to discuss another car he was interested in. He was watching a program on TV where they were restoring a 1956 Chevrolet pickup. They were advertising it as their favorite car to restore. Shows like that are fun to watch, but they're not at all like reality time-wise, that is. The show usually lasts an hour, and in that hour they show a complete restoration with no bodywork. Sometimes it is moved to a second show or another TV hour, whereas in reality a quality restoration can take over a year. I've always liked them, but there are so many that I don't think I want to invest in something that doesn't have a lot of potential to add value.
What do you think?
Honestly, I've never been interested in that model of truck, I told him. In fact, I've never been interested in Chevrolet trucks at all. I think I've mentioned before that George is a Chevy enthusiast. The only non-Chevrolet vehicle he had in his barn was a LaSalle. He justified this by saying that, truth be told, the LaSalle, like the Chevy, was built by General Motors. He decided to give up on the '56 pickup. I left shortly after that. Melissa wasn't mentioned. Our town has a rodeo every year or so. It's not one of the big ones, but it's still fun. This year it was held over Labor Day weekend. I went. One of my neighbors got me a pass and I started wandering around the backstage area where the animals are kept. I managed to get up close to the bulls, and I didn't immediately realize why the hell I even thought I could be a rodeo clown. These animals were huge and looked like they wanted to tear me to pieces. All thoughts of being a rodeo clown faded away quickly. The sheep were used for a children's activity, harnessing rams. Children volunteers wearing face shields and helmets cling to the sheep's backs and try to stay on them while they run around the arena. I was watching the sheep and thought I liked them better than the bulls when I felt someone near me. I looked over and there was a woman looking at the sheep too. "Aren't they cute?" she asked. "Yes, they are. And very tasty," I said, trying to make a joke. "I know," she said. "I love leg of lamb. It's a shame to think we have to slaughter animals like that so we can eat. Lamb's feet aren't one of those. They are too old. The best leg of lamb is spring lamb, and it comes from lambs that are less than 3 months old. These guys are a few years old, and they won't even make good lamb." She looked at me and laughed. "Oh my, thank you for that information. I guess I knew that, but I never thought of it that way. Now I'll never eat lamb again." She was wearing a press pass. "Excuse me. My name is Mark, by the way. Mark Leonard." She held out her hand. "I'm Sylvia Wyndham. I'm pleased to meet you, despite the cooking class." We both laughed. "You're from the press. Television, radio, or print?" "Print." She told me she works at our small local newspaper. "But sometimes I do news programs on television. I don't think I've seen you at any of them." "That's because I don't do local. If the national guys want to report, they ask me, not send one of their big guns." "Are you here doing something for them?" "No. This is for the newspaper." One of the participants in this rodeo met and married the daughter of a federal government official at one of the rodeos, and I'm interviewing him after the rodeo today. I noticed she didn't have a ring on her finger and continued the conversation. We ended up watching the rodeo together. Afterward, I went with her to the Cowboys trailer and watched her interview him and take a couple pictures. After that, we met at a restaurant and had dinner together. It was very casual and we talked mostly about the rodeo, the general atmosphere, and of course the animals. I told her about my belief that I could have been a clown until I was around bulls and thought I was crazy for not even thinking about it. I learned that she never thought a leg of lamb came from a lamb, she always thought it was a sheep. During the second dinner, we discussed the usual questions you expect to ask and receive to get to know the person you are going on a date with better. What do you do for a living? Are you married? Single? In a relationship? And things like that. I answered all of these questions honestly. But the third dinner was more like her interview with the cowboy that first time. The questions were sharper and more specific. How long were you married? Was the divorce amicable? Are you in touch with your ex? What was the cause of the divorce? Are you or she dating someone now? To these questions I brushed them aside. Only later, at home, did I remember Sylvia Wyndham's name. She was the reporter who had written the article about me not accepting Melissa's apology. She had also written a second article in which Melissa took the blame for falsely accusing me of adultery. Having memorized her name, I figured she must have either researched or memorized mine, figured out who I was, and was conducting a second interview. And just when I was starting to like her. Damn it. I considered continuing to date her and playing along with her, greatly exaggerating my answers to her questions, but decided against it. The other alternative was to just stop seeing her, which I did. The next time she called me, I told her
T was best we didn't see each other again. But why? Did I do something wrong? She asked.
I don't know if you did it or if you were going to, but I don't want to take any chances.
What do you mean?
If you're any kind of reporter, you've studied my past, so you know you've written 2 stories about me. And now that I remember who you are, I'll never know if you're dating me for me or for the chance to get another story. I live a quiet life and don't need or want any attention, good or bad.
I'm not accusing you of anything, but like I said, I don't want to take any chances. Mark, aren't you doing the same thing your ex-wife did?
She always thought that all men did was try to get something from her.
Aren't you accusing me of the same thing?
I realized who you were when I met you at the rodeo.
And you're partly right.
My first impulse was to find out the other story, but I changed my mind.
This has become our story with you, and I wish it were bigger.
I'm sorry, Sylvia, but I don't want to take any chances. And in her case, she had something tangible that men wanted, access to her father and his money, but the only thing I have for you is another story.
A temporary and short-lived one that will be forgotten by most people a week after you read it, and you'll move on to your next story. Aren't you doing to me what your ex-wife did to you? You're assuming I'm guilty without a trial.
The difference is that she and I have known each other much longer, and she should have at least been able to relate to me.
My only experience with you is the 2 stories you wrote about me. One good. One bad. I can't afford to take any chances. Goodbye.
2 days later, George called me.
What kind of trouble are you in? Not one that I know of. Why? Some journalist called and wanted to ask questions about you.
What did you say to her? I told her you and I were friends.
That's it? What? You wanted me to tell her more? No. Did she ask you anything? She was asking about you and Melissa. What about us?
If you were friends or enemies or communicating with each other.
What's going on?
I told him about meeting her.
So you think she was after you for a story?
I wasn't sure before, but now that you said she talked to you, I'm sure.
What else could it be?
You're probably right.
Oh, shit, gotta go. Melissa's trying to call. Talk to you later. An hour later, he called again. Your reporter called Melissa, too. They had a long talk. Well, that can't be good. Why not? You haven't done anything wrong, have you?
Of course not, but you of all people should know what reporters are like. I don't know much about your career in soccer, except that you've had enemies like Beglis and friends, but I'll bet it hasn't always been smooth sailing with the press.
He laughed out loud. You'd be right.
I had one reporter tearing my ass up for 20 years.
I could cure cancer and he'd still find something wrong with it.
I hope she drops it.
She didn't.
Just before Thanksgiving, I received a voicemail from my mom saying that there was an article about me in the paper.
That call was immediately followed by a call from George asking if I'd seen her. No. Do I want to? He laughed and hung up.
Online newspapers weren't too popular yet, so I went down to the corner store and bought one. It must have been a very slow day because the news was on the front page under the fold.
The really important stuff was on the top half of the folded newspaper.
The other, less important stuff was on the bottom half under the fold, so it wasn't visible until you picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was written by Sylvia, of course, and began with a story about how she and I met by chance at a rodeo and that I explained to her what a leg of lamb was compared to mutton. I didn't actually discuss mutton, but I think she was using poetic license for that part.
She went on to talk about our dinner and subsequent dates.
She explained that she didn't know who I was at first, but when she found out and remembered that she had previously written about my marriage and divorce from Melissa, she decided to continue dating me.
Her original intention was to get an update.
She had no idea where it would lead, but decided that her readers would be interested to know what happened with me and Melissa. She said she was surprised that our subsequent dinners were genuinely enjoyable and that I had restored her faith in men. This opinion was reinforced when she talked to my ex-wife and former father-in-law, who confirmed my character and personality. The article went on and on about how civilized and conflict-free divorce and post-separation relationships could be if Melissa and I were role models. Overall, a very enjoyable story, but it was still a story even though the tilt was in my favor. I called her cell phone and left a voicemail message telling her how enjoyable I found the story and thanking her. I was going to mention that I was right, and even though she wasn't going to write the story, I couldn't resist, but I didn't. I also didn't mention that we had another date. She called me later and we talked for a few minutes, but, again, didn't mention the date. Grace called me a few days later. She and George had made a donation to a charity that helped feed the homeless and needy. They were going to help hand out food on Thanksgiving and thought I would be interested in helping. My mom and I were going to eat together, nothing special, just us together. Handing out food can be a rewarding experience, so my mom and I decided to eat later so I could serve. I arrived early to have a look around. Lots of volunteers were doing all sorts of work, cooking, setting up dishes, stacking dishes. George was pulling the turkey out of the oven and Grace was setting up the tables. I said hello to George, who looked at me. "Don't be mad. We had nothing to do with it." "What are you talking about?" I asked. He was still holding the hot turkey and turned his head toward the sinks. Sylvia was standing there elbow deep in water and washing pots and pans. "We didn't know she'd be here. She's doing a report on the band. She said she didn't know we'd be here either. I was going to call you as soon as I put the damn turkey down and give you a heads up." I watched her for a few seconds as he looked for a place to put the turkey. "What are you going to do?" he asked, turning back to me. "Say hello, I guess." So I did. I walked up to her and said hello. She looked surprised, then smiled and handed me a towel. "Dry please," and she pointed to a stack of pots and pans. I dried until we were both called to the serving line. For 30 minutes I served candied apples with marshmallow topping, then, after a break, mashed potatoes, then peas and other entrees. The line was constant, with children and a few elderly people. I hadn't realized there were so many homeless people here, and commented to Sylvia. "They're not just homeless. Some of them are just hungry." After everyone was fed, the volunteers ate some of what was left if they wanted. Neither Sylvia nor I felt hungry, but we sat with George and Grace and drank coffee until everyone had finished eating and then cleaned up. Everyone came over and patted George on the back and thanked him and Grace. When they left, Sylvia and I talked for a while. She told me that she sometimes volunteers at some charitable organizations, but this was the first time she had been to this one. It was just a nice coincidence that George, Grace, and I were there too. My skepticism was what it was, and I wasn't sure I believed her. When we left, it was later than I thought. We said goodbye, and I took the leftovers to my mom. A couple days later I called Sylvia and we went out to dinner. I found out that she, like me, was divorced. That was pretty bittersweet. She told me that after writing the last story about me, she called him and they talked. It was a nice conversation. We realized that just because we no longer loved each other was no reason not to be friends. After all, we were friends before we were married. You taught me that, Mark, and I think others can realize the same. Of course, not everyone agrees with that philosophy and clings to hatred and bitterness, but that's fine with them. She paused for a moment before continuing. "I was going to apologize for the last story, Mark. I did exactly as you suggested. I wasn't going to do it at first, but I was a little upset that you felt that way. In a fit of anger, I wrote it. Then I regretted it and felt I had betrayed you, so I decided not to publish it, but my editor saw it, thought it was a nice story for the season, and published it." I voiced my displeasure and almost laughed, but he showed me the readers' comments. "They liked it, Mark. And they liked you. And Melissa. And they liked your story. I think it could have changed some lives." We dated a lot after that, and just after New Year's Eve we had sex for the first time. It was a long time for me, and even longer for her. The last time she had sex was with a guy she dated for over a year before they broke up. Over the Christmas holidays, George took me to several charitable organizations, and I got to see how he worked. Every day he met with one group of people or another who needed money. I never once saw him turn anyone down. They may not have gotten everything they asked for, but everyone got something. Melissa was barely mentioned until I brought her up.
Was Melissa home for Christmas?
I asked.
Not this year.
She met a guy and wants to spend the day with him.
I chuckled. So your plan worked?
Not even close. I thought that when she was there, you two would miss each other and get back together. I told her she was going there to forget you, and apparently she did. You both fooled the shit out of me, and I'm not easily fooled.
Is that okay with you?
Of course.
I just want my daughter and my young friend to be happy, and it sounds like you both are.
Melissa never went back to live. She comes a couple times a year and George and Grace visit her husband and their grandchildren.
I still have my 58.
In fact, George drove Sylvia and I in it from the church to a wedding reception at his house. He was my best man, and we made the national news again. The press thought our story was interesting.
I think so, too.
Maddie called me after she saw us on TV and asked if this story of me being on the news would go on forever. I replied that I hoped so. I still help him build his car collection and even bought a couple collector cars for myself. I keep them with him.